Deep in the Ozark Mountains, where the mist hangs heavy and silence feels older than time, a discovery shattered the quiet in 1964. A forest ranger on routine duty stumbled into a hidden valley, a place untouched for generations. What he found there was not just a family, but an entire bloodline, cut off from the outside world, trapped inside a system of its own making. Imagine cabins no map ever recorded, sons who had never seen a schoolhouse, brothers and uncles who spoke a dialect the outside world couldn't fully understand, and a lineage where the same blood circled endlessly, leaving its mark in ways both physical and haunting. This wasn't simply rural isolation. It was a world built on secrecy, rigid tradition, and a belief that the outside was a threat. A hidden chapter of American history, one that forces us to ask, how could this have gone unnoticed for so long? And what happens when a family's only law is its own blood? Before we open the gates to this story, make sure you're along for the journey. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering hidden corners of history. Your support helps bring forgotten stories like this one back into the light. The Ozark Mountains in 1964 were a world of thick forests, hidden ridges, and winding streams that seemed to vanish into endless green. Few men ventured far beyond the marked trails, and those who did rarely found anything unexpected. That changed when a United States Forest Service ranger named James Harrington was sent into Shannon County. His mission seemed routine: survey land for possible expansion of Mark Twain National Forest. For Harrington, it was another day's work, until the trees began whispering something different. He followed an unmapped stream deeper into the woods, the kind of place where silence feels alive, pressing against the skin. A faint curl of smoke rose through the canopy, so thin it might have been mistaken for mist. Curiosity sharpened his steps. Soon, a crude fence came into view, wooden posts hammered together without precision, but with determination. Past it, cabins emerged, rough, hand-hewn structures that had no place on any government record. For Harrington, it was as though he'd stumbled into another century. Smoke billowed from stone chimneys, chickens clucked in small pens, and barefoot boys darted through the brush, watching him with eyes both curious and cautious. He identified himself as a government man, hoping to ease the tension. Yet before words could settle, an older figure stepped forward, gaunt, bearded, holding a shotgun angled in Harrington's direction. The message was clear: strangers were unwelcome. Harrington's training in biology made the moment more chilling. Even in a brief glance, he noticed something uncanny among the sons and brothers. Faces carrying near-identical features, unusual postures, and physical signs that hinted at generations of closed bloodlines. The older man spoke in a dialect that bent English into something half-recognizable. "No stranger brings anything good," he barked. Behind him, young men clustered together, their expressions hardened by a lifetime of warnings about outsiders. Harrington didn't press further. He retreated slowly, every step heavy with the realization that this was not merely a family living off the land. It was a bloodline, isolated, generation stacked upon generation, hidden in plain sight. Once back in safe distance, he recorded everything he had seen. The testimony, later sealed for decades, described cabins, livestock, and boys with deformities so visible he couldn't ignore them. It was a discovery that felt less like chance, more like fate. The Ozarks were known for harboring reclusive communities. Men had lived off-grid for centuries, carving lives in places others deemed unlivable. But what Harrington had found transcended ordinary isolation. It was as if time itself had folded in on this valley. Authorities struggled to comprehend the ranger's report. How could an entire bloodline vanish from census records, school rolls, and even church logs? How could sons grow into fathers and fathers into grandfathers without the outside world ever knowing? Investigators pieced together scraps of history, a birth certificate here, a property deed there. Slowly, the figure of Jeremiah Holloway emerged, a young man who, in the late 1800s, had led his brothers, cousins, and sons into the wilderness to disappear. The Holloway property sat 30 kilometers from the nearest town, ringed by steep ridges like natural walls. Access required a narrow trail that vanished under snow each winter. Geography had become both shield and prison for the family. For decades, the Holloways existed in shadows. No school teachers ever reached the valley, no officials checked on the sons growing up there. By the 20th century, it was as if the family had been erased from Missouri altogether. When Harrington stumbled upon them in 1964, he wasn't just confronting individuals. He was staring into a social microcosm, boys raised with no concept of outside history, men convinced that blood should never leave the family circle. The Rangers' discovery forced the county into a moral storm. Was this a matter of personal freedom, or a tragedy demanding intervention? How could society respect independence while confronting the clear signs of suffering within this closed brotherhood? What Harrington had seen was only the beginning. The Holloway clan would soon be thrust into the harsh light of scrutiny, exposing not just their valley, but the questions America preferred to leave buried in its forgotten hills. In 1881, Jeremiah Holloway, a young man hardened by whispers of lawlessness in Kentucky, vanished into the Ozark Mountains. He carried with him not daughters or wives, but brothers, cousins, and sons willing to follow him into exile. The land he purchased was remote, rugged, and considered worthless by surveyors. To Jeremiah, it was perfect, a fortress of ridges and forests where no lawman would pursue him and no stranger would question his choices. With his closest blood at his side, cousins named Isaiah and Thaddeus, younger brother Constance, and the first sons of his line, Jeremiah began carving out a world where outside eyes would never intrude again. Cabins rose from timber felled by their own hands. Cornfields were cut into hillsides with sweat and stubbornness. The Holloway men became their own carpenters, hunters, and farmers, building a settlement bound only by loyalty to blood. For years, Jeremiah occasionally descended to the nearest community for supplies. Pastors invited him to Sunday gatherings, but he always refused. His sons were never seen, and his cousins kept to the high valley. The last mention of Jeremiah in church diaries came in 1890. After that, silence. From then on, no outsider laid eyes on Holloway land. The first generation sealed itself inside its chosen prison of ridges. The philosophy behind this isolation grew darker. Jeremiah preached that pure blood must remain untouched by strangers. To him, weakness came not from hunger or hardship, but from mixing bloodlines beyond the circle of brothers and sons. This doctrine shaped every decision. Sons were paired with cousins, brothers arranged unions among themselves, and the clan began carefully recording bloodlines in ledgers, attempting to maintain strength while unknowingly compounding hidden frailties. By the turn of the century, the Holloways had grown into a small brotherhood of 15. They plowed fields, raised livestock, and buried their dead in a makeshift graveyard. The outside world vanished from their daily thought. The men created a belief system that fused scripture with superstition. They told their sons that outsiders carried sickness and sin, that only Holloway blood was chosen, and that leaving the valley would invite ruin. Geographers later studying the valley called it strategic isolation. Every ridge served as a wall, every stream as a moat. Geography reinforced ideology, and ideology ensured geography would never again be crossed. Through hardship, the men adapted. They grew stronger in their labor, yet weaker in unseen ways. The same faces repeated across generations, their features echoing like reflections in a narrowing mirror. Sons became fathers, fathers' grandfathers, all sharing the same line. When census takers arrived in 1900, they recorded only fragments. The Holloways allowed brief conversation, but barred access to their cabins. The head of the family answered curtly, his sons silent, his cousins glaring. It was the last time any government record acknowledged them for more than 60 years. From then on, the Holloway name became a ghost, spoken in rumor but absent from the documents of Missouri. Decades passed, and events that shaped the outside world, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, never touched the valley. Sons born there grew into men who never heard of presidents, battles, or cities beyond the mountains. Their heritage was rewritten as legend. Jeremiah became more than ancestor. He was revered as patriarch, lawmaker, and prophet. His rules, pure blood, closed circle, loyalty to brothers, became scripture in a book handwritten by their own hands. The Holloway legacy of the first generation was not just survival in the wilderness, but the creation of a sealed bloodline, a world of men bound to one another, locked in an echo chamber of their own making. And so by the time Ranger Harrington stumbled across them in 1964, he wasn't just finding a hidden family. He was stepping into a century-old vision, born in one man's decision to disappear. The Holloway Valley grew into a world entirely of men, ruled by a council of elders. These elders, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, held absolute power, deciding who labored the fields, who hunted, and who continued the bloodline. From boyhood, sons were taught that their destiny was already chosen. A boy's first task was obedience, his second, loyalty to blood. By adolescence, he was told he must strengthen the family through union. The council met in the largest cabin, its walls lined with crude genealogies. These hand-drawn charts became sacred, guiding which cousin would be joined to which brother's son, binding the circle tighter each generation. Full brothers were kept apart, but half-brothers were considered suitable. Uncles paired nephews, cousins merged with cousins. To outsiders, it might seem unimaginable, but inside the valley it was law, as binding as scripture. When a boy reached his first signs of maturity, his fate was decided by the elders. No choice was his own. The union was arranged, and he was told it was the will of blood. In the minds of the Holloways, this practice was not shameful, but noble. They believed they were protecting strength, keeping weakness at bay, and guarding the valley against corruption from outsiders. As years passed, this closed circle shaped language itself. The Holloway men spoke in phrases heavy with symbols of blood and kinship. Words like weak blood or true line replaced any concept of outside names. A boy born with deformities was not seen as broken, but as marked by the blood's power. Traits outsiders would call illness were embraced as proof that the Holloways carried unique strength. The elders reinforced this belief with stories. Around fires, grandfathers told sons that outsiders died from mixing lines, while Holloways endured. Those with twisted fingers or failing eyes were considered chosen. A leather-bound rule book, passed through generations, codified everything. Part scripture, part manual, it combined biblical fragments with invented laws. The entries revealed a strange mixture of superstition and primitive genetic instinct. Inside the book, unions were carefully planned. Entire pages tracked bloodlines, marking which cousins could join with which nephews, as if by arranging carefully, they might ward off the dangers they half-sensed. The system gave structure but also shackled the Holloway men. None were free to decide their lives. Sons became fathers under rules written before they were born, while uncles enforced traditions they no longer questioned. Labor was divided along physical strength. Younger boys carried wood and fetched water. Older brothers plowed fields or hunted game, while grandfathers oversaw. Everything in the valley operated like gears turning in a clock wound by blood. Schooling never existed. Instead, knowledge passed from father to son, brother to brother. Reading faded, writing became rare, and the only education was labor, tradition, and the laws of the council. Yet, despite the rigid system, cracks appeared. Some sons whispered of leaving, of seeing beyond the ridges. These murmurs were crushed quickly by stories of men who ventured out and never returned. The patriarch's control was absolute. Strangers were painted as demons who stole boys from their blood. This fear ensured loyalty, keeping generations bound to a valley that felt less like refuge, more like cage. What emerged was a brotherhood where individuality dissolved. Each son's life was mapped long before birth. Each uncle's authority stemmed not from merit, but from position in the bloodline. The Holloway circle became self-sustaining and self-devouring. This system of arranged unions and strict obedience guaranteed the Holloways' survival for nearly a century, but survival came at a cost. With every generation, the closed circle tightened, and the toll of isolation deepened. Life in the Holloway Valley was shaped by routine, repetition, and rules handed down through generations of fathers and grandfathers. From the moment a boy could walk, he was assigned tasks essential for survival. The youngest sons carried wood, hauled water from streams, and tended fires. Slightly older boys learned to plant corn and beans, while their older brothers guided them with rough patience, passing knowledge like an heirloom. Grandfathers oversaw every task, leaning on carved sticks, their authority absolute. They judged whether fields were plowed straight, animals fed properly, or cabins repaired with skill. Their words carried weight heavier than tools or weapons. Hunting remained sacred work. Uncles led younger brothers into the forests, teaching them to track deer and wild turkey. Every kill was a lesson in skill, silence, and the belief that Holloway blood conquered wilderness. Meals reflected the land itself: cornbread, beans, pork, and wild game. Yet though stomachs were filled, nutrition was lacking. Sons grew tall but frail, their bodies showing signs of a lineage repeating itself too often. Clothing was stitched by hand from cotton and wool, woven crudely but worn with pride. A boy's first shirt or boots weren't bought, but made by older brothers who reminded him that dependence on outsiders was weakness. Language inside the valley was a world apart. Over generations, the Holloways shaped their own dialect, blending archaic words with invented terms. To them, it was natural speech, but outsiders later compared it to half-forgotten English. Doctors never entered the valley, so knowledge of sickness came from observation. Grandfathers described conditions in cryptic terms: weak blood, deep eyes, shallow chest. These words carried authority even when the illnesses had names unknown to them. Death was frequent, especially among newborn sons. A graveyard marked with wooden crosses held countless Holloway boys who never reached manhood. Grandfathers explained this as destiny, proof that only the strongest blood would endure. Education, as the outside world knew it, didn't exist. There were no schools, no books, no classrooms. Instead, every boy's lessons were in survival: felling trees, sharpening axes, plowing earth, and following the rules etched into memory. At night, fires burned and stories filled the silence. Brothers told tales of Jeremiah, the patriarch who led them into exile. He was remembered as prophet, warrior, and lawgiver whose vision shaped every Holloway life. Religion became a hybrid of scripture and family myth. Elders preached that Holloway blood was chosen, while outsiders were cursed. Prayers were muttered before meals, but they sounded more like oaths of loyalty to kin. Tools and furniture were handmade, built by calloused hands. Boys learned to carve spoons from oak, craft chairs from pine, and mend plows with iron scraps. Each object carried the stamp of necessity and endurance. Medicine came from roots, herbs, and superstition. Uncles boiled bark into bitter teas for fevers, while grandfathers pressed poultices of leaves onto wounds. Some remedies worked, others failed, but trust in tradition never wavered. Time moved differently inside the valley. Seasons, not calendars, marked the rhythm of life. Planting, harvesting, hunting, and chopping wood defined the year. Birthdays were rarely remembered. What mattered was a boy becoming strong enough to work. Isolation hardened the Holloway men. They distrusted any mention of outsiders, warning sons that strangers brought sickness and death. These lessons weren't abstract. They were stories of fear meant to bind each boy tighter to the valley. By 1964, when discovery finally came, the Holloway men had lived this way for over 8 decades. Sons had become fathers, fathers had become grandfathers, and still the cycle repeated, a closed world unbroken by time. Life in the valley wasn't just survival. It was a prison of tradition. Every boy's path was chosen before birth, every man's life dictated by blood, and every grandfather's voice echoed like law carved into stone. The Holloway Valley appeared timeless, but beneath the routine cracks were widening. Generations of closed bloodlines left their mark not just in appearance, but in the health, strength, and survival of the Holloway sons. Fingers fused together, jaws that didn't quite align, eyes clouded from birth, these were seen among many boys. To the outside world, they would be called deformities. Inside the valley, they were called family traits. Grandfathers told the younger sons that such marks proved the blood was strong. Bent spines, twisted hands, and weak lungs were explained away as proof of heritage, not evidence of decline. It became normalized, yet survival rates told another story. Graves filled with boys who never reached adulthood. Infant mortality soared, and even those who survived often carried chronic weakness. Still, no Holloway sought help beyond the ridges. Nutrition faltered. Meals of corn, beans, pork, and wild greens filled bellies but lacked variety. The lack of medical care, combined with genetic repetition, created a cycle of frailty that deepened with each generation. Outsiders later described the pattern as inbreeding depression, but within the valley it was reframed as destiny. Sons grew up believing that frailty was a burden placed on chosen blood, a mark of endurance. Language itself reflected this distortion. A boy with anemia was called weak blood. One born with shrunken eyes was called deep eyes. These phrases masked reality, cloaking illness in superstition passed down by grandfathers. The Council of Elders kept meticulous records in their leather-bound rule book. They tracked unions, births, and deaths, unaware that their system only magnified the very conditions they tried to avoid. A boy like Timothy, born with a skull fused too early, lived in pain. His head throbbed, his sight faded. Yet his family saw him as a symbol of strength, not sickness. The normalization ran deep. When questioned decades later, one young Holloway explained, "My brother's joined fingers show he carries the true blood." To him, deformity was identity, not affliction. This worldview made intervention nearly impossible. If weakness was defined as strength, if suffering was seen as destiny, then no boy raised inside the valley could imagine another way to live. Still, whispers of doubt surfaced. Some younger brothers wondered why so many graves were filled with sons. They asked questions quietly, but the council silenced them with tales of outsiders bringing disease and ruin. Physical decline was mirrored by intellectual decline. Without schools, without books, generations of Holloways lost basic literacy. A few older men remembered how to scrawl their names, but most younger boys knew only labor and myth. Their world grew smaller. Vocabulary shrank, horizons narrowed. For the Holloways, knowledge was not written but spoken. Stories of Jeremiah and the council's laws replaced history, science, and any connection to the world beyond the valley. By mid-century, the signs of strain were undeniable. Nearly every younger son showed some form of impairment, yet the cycle of arranged unions continued. The council believed only blood could save them, even as blood destroyed them. From the outside perspective, it was tragedy. From the inside, it was tradition. That collision of interpretation, outsiders seeing suffering, insiders seeing destiny, made the Holloway case one of the most haunting in American history. When authorities finally entered the valley, they faced not just a community with failing health, but a world view that resisted correction. The strain was visible in every body, but invisible in the minds shaped by generations. The Holloway story by 1964 was no longer one of mere survival. It had become a study in how a bloodline can eat itself from within, while believing all the while that it was thriving. When the Holloway Valley was revealed in 1964, county authorities faced a situation unlike anything they had ever seen. An entire brotherhood, sealed for generations, stood before lawmen, doctors, and investigators, uncertain how to proceed. The first priority was medical. Doctors rushed to examine the Holloway sons, many of whom carried visible deformities. Twisted bones, fused fingers, and clouded eyes spoke of generations bound by the same blood. 8 boys were taken immediately to hospitals. Conditions that textbooks described but few doctors had seen in practice were suddenly present. A 7-year-old named Timothy underwent emergency skull surgery that saved his life but left permanent damage. Brothers who had never seen a clinic now lay in hospital beds, surrounded by machines they couldn't comprehend. For them, medicine seemed like sorcery, and the men treating them were strangers wielding impossible tools. Meanwhile, the legal dilemma deepened. None of the Holloway unions had ever been formally recorded. Many sons had no birth certificates. The law demanded accountability. But how could men raised outside society be judged by its rules? A county judge took a cautious approach. Rather than immediate charges, he placed minors under temporary protection and ordered evaluations. The focus shifted from punishment to understanding, though critics argued this was leniency toward abuse. Resistance came swiftly. The Holloway patriarch Odiah rallied the brothers. He warned them that outsiders intended to scatter the family, destroy their bloodline, and erase their way of life. Fear turned into defiance. For weeks, deputies camped near the valley. Grandfathers refused to release sons for examination. Tension simmered, rifles visible in cabin doorways as negotiations dragged on. The line between enforcement and intrusion grew razor thin. 3 teenagers even escaped custody, trekking back toward the valley through dense woods. Their capture underscored the powerful grip of tradition. Sons would rather risk the wilderness than abandon the blood that defined them. Psychological assessments painted a grim picture. Many Holloway men had no concept of law beyond the council's rules. Their morality was shaped entirely by brothers and uncles, blind to wider society standards. Social workers described them as men trapped in another century. Some were aggressive, others withdrawn, most bewildered. Yet all shared a conviction that Holloway law was the only law worth following. Doctors, however, saw something else. A living case study of genetic isolation. Rare conditions were documented, cataloged, and analyzed. The Holloways, unknowingly, became subjects of research that would later inform advances in genetic medicine. But in 1964, the focus was survival. Children weakened by untreated conditions were stabilized. Malnourished boys were fed proper diets for the first time in their lives. For them, bread and milk tasted like miracles. Public reaction was fierce. Newspapers demanded answers. How could an entire bloodline vanish in mid-century America? Editorials condemned officials for failing to protect sons from lives of ignorance and suffering hidden deep in the Ozarks. Inside institutions, the Holloway boys faced new challenges. Some adapted slowly, learning to read, learning that the outside world did not kill on sight. Others remained silent, longing for cabins, fires, and the security of kin. Odiah and the elder uncles refused to cooperate fully. They clung to the valley as sacred, arguing that outsiders would twist their story. To them, intervention was not rescue, but invasion. In truth, both perspectives carried weight. The Holloways had survived through their own rules, but survival came at devastating cost. Authorities wrestled with a question: were they saving the sons or dismantling a culture? The 1964 intervention would become a landmark case. one that forced Missouri and eventually the nation to confront the clash between isolation, tradition, and responsibility. For the Holloways, it marked the beginning of the end of secrecy. When the Holloway Valley finally emptied, the silence it left was heavy. Cabins stood abandoned. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys, and the graves of countless Holloway sons lay scattered beneath crooked wooden crosses. Authorities placed the younger boys in foster homes, while older brothers were sent to institutions. Some struggled against the new world, clinging desperately to memories of the valley, while others began the slow process of adaptation. One boy, adopted by a family of schoolteachers, eventually learned to read and write, becoming a nurse who cared for others. He later admitted his drive came from memories of brothers who never received help. Yet not all Holloways found such paths. Many carried impairments too severe for independence. Records show nearly 40% of adult brothers remained in state care for life, their days structured by routines they never fully understood. Those who tried to live freely often faltered. Raised on fear of outsiders, some became reclusive, unable to form bonds. They carried the valley within them, its silence echoing in their every step. For the medical community, the Holloways became a reference point. Their genetic records, carefully documented, contributed to understanding rare conditions. Doctors referred to it as the Ozark cohort, a case that advanced the study of recessive traits. But for the Holloway sons themselves, being studied was a double-edged sword. To them, they were not specimens, but men struggling to build identities in a world that judged them by the scars of their bloodline. Some drawings by Timothy, the boy who survived skull surgery, revealed haunting memories. Vibrant colors contrasted with images of cabins, twisted trees, and brothers with distorted features. His art became an anthropological window into life inside the valley. Timothy lived into his 30s, longer than many predicted, but never escaped institutional care. His drawings, however, outlived him, preserved by universities as fragments of a story too important to be forgotten. Public memory of the Holloways remained conflicted. Newspapers portrayed them as victims of cruelty and ignorance, while scholars argued they were also symbols of resilience in the face of abandonment by wider society. For Missouri lawmakers, the case forced reform. The Rural Community Protection Act of 1967 mandated regular checks on isolated regions, ensuring that no sons would again vanish into valleys unseen for decades. Meanwhile, the Holloway property became part of the national forest. Some argued it should be preserved as a historical site, but others rejected the idea, unwilling to enshrine a place associated with so much suffering. In the end, only the small cemetery was restored. Simple stones replaced decayed wooden markers, offering dignity to Holloway boys who never knew life beyond the valley's ridges. Their resting place became the story's quiet monument. By the year 2000, fewer than 15 Holloways were alive. Many had succumbed young, victims of fragile health and compounded genetics. The family tree, once a dense knot, withered into scattered branches. Yet those who survived carried voices worth hearing. One man later testified that the greatest distance between the Holloways and society was not miles, but neglect, the refusal to see them even as they vanished. For historians, the Holloways represented more than tragedy. They were a stark example of how isolation, tradition, and fear could imprison generations of sons inside a cycle of decline, all under the banner of loyalty to blood. The aftermath was therefore not just a reckoning for the Holloways, but a mirror for America itself. It forced society to confront forgotten communities and the silent suffering that thrives when no one dares to look. And though the cabins rotted and the valley grew wild again, the Holloway story remained, etched not in the ridges of Missouri, but in the lives of sons who bore the weight of a closed bloodline. The Holloway case remains one of America's darkest reminders of what happens when isolation is left unchecked. A valley of fathers and sons became proof that tradition, when unchallenged, can twist into something destructive. Historians argue the Holloways show how geography shapes destiny. The Ozark ridges were more than scenery. They were walls. Behind them, generations of brothers forged a world apart, convinced that blood alone would preserve them. But the lesson is sharper than geography. It lies in how ignorance and fear, handed down from grandfathers to sons, can become stronger than truth. When myth replaces knowledge, entire bloodlines can vanish from view. Medical scholars point to the Holloways as a textbook case of genetic isolation. Dozens of rare conditions were cataloged, advancing modern science. Yet behind every case was a boy, a brother, a man living with pain. The tragedy is not only biological, it is social. Without schools, books, or contact, Holloway sons grew up without choices. Their world shrank to a valley, their fates mapped by rules older than themselves. Lawmakers recognized this danger. Missouri's reforms ensured no boy would again disappear into such silence. The Holloways changed policy, showing that even one hidden valley can reshape how a nation protects its most vulnerable. For anthropologists, the Holloways embodied the fine line between cultural autonomy and harmful isolation. Brothers defended their customs as sacred, but outsiders saw those customs as abuse. That clash forces us to ask, where does freedom end? The answer is never simple. Some Holloway sons later confessed they longed for the valley, even knowing its harms. To them, blood and tradition meant belonging, something the outside world often failed to provide. Others found strength in leaving. They built new lives, becoming teachers, nurses, or workers. Yet even they admitted the valley never fully left them. Its silence followed, shaping how they saw themselves forever. The cemetery remains the truest monument. Simple stones, etched with names of boys who never reached manhood, remind visitors that the cost of isolation is measured not in theories, but in lives cut short. The Holloway legacy is paradoxical. Their suffering advanced genetics, reshaped laws, and sparked awareness of forgotten communities. Yet for the brothers themselves, legacy mattered less than survival, waking each day in cabins that felt eternal. To this day, hikers in Mark Twain National Forest sometimes stumble across faint clearings, crumbled chimneys, or weathered fence posts. Few realize these ruins once sheltered a brotherhood that lived and died by its own rules. The story also lingers as warning. In an age of technology, it is easy to assume no one can vanish, but the Holloways remind us neglect, geography, and fear can still erase entire lives. At its heart, the Holloway saga asks us to consider responsibility. Should society have found them sooner? Should grandfathers have chosen differently? Or was the outcome inevitable once Jeremiah led his bloodline into exile? For descendants, the weight of history remains. Even generations later, the Holloway name carries echoes of the valley. Sons raised outside its walls still carry questions about what it means to inherit such a past. Perhaps the deepest lesson is humility. No community, no family, is immune to the consequences of isolation. The Holloways were not monsters, but men, fathers and sons caught in a system larger than themselves. Their story lingers not because it is comfortable, but because it is haunting. It forces us to see how easily silence, tradition, and fear can combine to create prisons no bars can contain. And so the Holloway Valley stands as both caution and remembrance, a place where blood became law, where sons became trapped, and where America learned that even hidden valleys hold truths we cannot afford to ignore.